Do you want to fill your entire screen with flashing lights while your board pings like a slot machine? Do you want to make a war crime powered by a Rube Goldberg machine? Do you want to play the most adorable robot in the game who also has the cutest cards in the game? Then Dooley might just be the hero for you. This guide's going to go over how Dooley works, how to play him, and some of the common archetypes you're going to look for in Dooley runs. Rather than building around a single item or set of items and buffing them over the course of a run like Pig or Vanessa often do, Dooley more so relies on cultivating a board where items synergize with each other like a weird little contraption. There's lots of activations and interactions working with each other to scale your damage to defeat your opponent. Dooley's main mechanics are the cores, charging, shielding, haste, burn, and your friend and tech synergies. Main things Dooley struggles with on the flip side are upfront damage, scaling over the course of days, econ, healing, sometimes crit, depends on the core. So let's start at the beginning. At the start of each run, you select from 2 core options. There are a total of 6 cores, so you want to make sure you're familiar what to do with at least a few of them, because you can't always guarantee you'll get the one you like best. Note that there are plenty of builds that don't rely on a specific core, so don't be afraid to dump it if your build isn't shaping up to be the one that needs it around. We'll start with the Armored Core. This one charges when you use any item to the left of it and buffs the shield values of items to the right. Generally, you want to focus on 1 to 2 shield items and then some faster items on the left to speed up the activation if you're planning on using the core in your build. The general payoffs for this core are bunker, force field, and some high tier angry balloon bot shenanigans. Some of the common skills to look out for are critical protector, defensive stance, electrical hull, hardened shield, sharp corners, and titanium casing. The general gameplay with this core is to build up a huge amount of shield by buffing your shielding items with your core, and then utilizing that shield to kill your opponent with either an angry balloon bot or, more commonly, a force field. This core, however, tends to struggle against poison builds, in particular before you have force field, as Dooley has very little healing available to survive the poison, and balloon bot relies on depleting the shield to gain power. And as poison just completely ignores the shield, your balloon bot doesn't gain power and your shield doesn't keep you alive. However, once you have force field, you can utilize that to your own advantage, as they can't get rid of your shield. You just, infinitely gain damage on your force field and are able to take them out quite quickly. If you have room on your board for it, Security Camera can be a powerful enabler for the Armored Core, as crit buffs are often hard to find in Dooley's kit. The most common archetype you're going to look for with Armored Core is generally going to be a force field one-shot build. We'll talk about that a bit more later, but it generally relies on defense grid, force field, something like bunker or an obsidian enchant or a shiny enchant, and then just getting it to go off as fast as possible to one-shot your opponent. Unfortunately, this doesn't actually utilize your core, which makes this one a little lackluster in the current patch. Next up is the Companion Core, which is one of my favorite cores, and it works a little differently than all the other cores. This one is, it charges whenever an item with the friend tag is activated anywhere on the board, doesn't matter right or left, and when it is activated, it gives haste to the items adjacent to it. They don't have to be friends, so you can use friends to charge up the core, and then haste non-friends if you would like. Or you can just use it as rocket boots. It's worth noting that the core itself has a friend tag, so when it activates, it'll trigger other friend synergies itself, and it benefits from other friend items or synergies like Robotics Factory. Early to mid-game, it can be viable just as a source of haste, as I mentioned, like rocket boots, and even in late-game builds, sometimes people will utilize it with things like Pulse Rifle or Rocket Launcher, just to give them the very valuable haste that they need to spam off their damage. Some of the core early items you want to look for are First Aidin, missiles, Chem Snail, and Monitor Lizard. Brick Buddy can also help too early on. Your general game plan early on is to keep yourself alive using things like Aiden and Brick Buddy, and killing your opponent with a poison source like Chem Snail or Monitor Lizard, or even Drill. Later on, you're going to transition out of these friends. Make sure you don't stick to the early game ones, as they fall off quite hard later in the game, unfortunately. You're going to be looking for things like Clarence, Race Carl, Ballista, Bulldozer, and the DJ Robot. Some important skills to look for when utilizing this core are Beautiful Friendship, Intrusion countermeasures, Defense Grid, Fire Power, and any freeze or slow skills that work with your build. This core generally struggles with things like Sustain or Utility, as a lot of your board is going to be filled with friends that are just contributing towards your main game plan. You don't have a lot of room for Utility, and so it is important to try to get those through skills. Some of the common archetypes you will see with this build are Dinos, specifically Momosaur, friend synergy builds such as Clarence or Ballista, or an aggro build utilizing DJ Robot and his nanobots. Next up, we have the Critical Core. This one has one of the simplest effects, but its game plan is one of the strangest out of any of the cores. This one charges from items to the left of it, like most of the cores, or from any item critting. This does result in double charges when something to the left of it crits, or when the core itself crits, it will charge itself. Core passively gives crits to the items to the right of it, as well as itself. The general game plan with this core is to use it for its crit rate early on, utilizing powerful items like rocket launcher or pulse rifle, and then later on you can transition into using the core itself as a weapon. Do this through items like Metronome paired with a rapid source of haste like GPU, Metronome, or Pyrocarbon, and this build generally relies on lowering the cooldown of the core through skills, Diamond Scrap, Feathers, and Wings. Important skills include anything that provides crit, Frozen Synapse, and free skills, and Paralyzing Rush. We'll go into much more detail on the actual core Hypercarry build later in the video. Next up is the Ignition Core, which is considered one of the strongest cores in the current patch. Ignition Core itself is pretty straightforward. Items to the left of it charge it, and increase the burn value of items to the right of it, while providing modest burn by itself. With this core, your game plan is generally to spam items to the left of it to trigger it as fast as possible, and occasionally you will use it to buff some items to the right of the core. However, unintuitively, you often want your burn items to the left of the core, even though they would get buffed to the right. The reason is because burn itself has inherent scaling as you stack it up on your enemy, and so triggering the core more often generally will provide more value than stacking burn on a few items on the few other burn items that you have. This also allows you to increase the amount of burn triggers you get, which can increase synergy with things like drill and solar farm. And so generally, early in the game you may want to stack some burn, but later in the game you'll almost always have your core to the far right if you're utilizing it on the board. As the burn core often struggles with defenses, you want to plan for protracted fight. You don't want to plan for protracted fights later in the game, and instead you just want to burst them down with as much burn as possible and rely on the intrinsic scaling of stacking burn on your opponent. Some core items to look out for are the rocket launcher. Particularly early on, rocket launcher can be extremely powerful. Drill, soldering gun, solar farm, nitro, microdave, and omega ray. Important skills include fiery, final flame, quick ignition, immolating spark, conflagration, crossfire, and heat shield. Our penultimate core is the core itself. This one charges, as you would expect, from items to the left of it, but it charges items to the right of it by 1 second once it goes off. As you might expect, this core mostly wants a bunch of small items to the left and one big, powerful, high cooldown item to the right that it's going to charge. Common items to charge with the core are Bazaar, Cybersecurity, Flamethrower, Combat Core, and Crane. And the items to the left of it are generally little fast ones like Uzi, Nitro, First Aid, and GPU. Although there's a trick with GPU where often early in the game you'll want it to the right to increase haste uptime on the core itself. This core can be quite versatile, and it's tricky to recommend specific skills with it due to the versatility of builds it can have, but in general, some good ones include right-handed, right eye, firepower, and buddy system, as these will allow it to have a lower cooldown and benefit the item to the right of it that it is going to be buffing. And then last but not least, we have the Weaponized Core. So this one charges from items to the left of it, like most of our cores, and it provides flat damage buffs to items on the right. This one has a lot of build overlaps with the core, but it tends to have a much stronger early game as it is able to scale the power of things like Pulse Rifle or Uzi or Fang, any other small fast weapons you're able to get. Important items with this are quite similar to the core, but with a much greater focus on Flamethrower as the chase item to play with it. Flamethrower, of course, benefits greatly from the flat damage buffs it's able to provide, and can greatly scale the burn you're able to apply with it. However, there's some interesting ones you can also do, such as the Ritual Dagger from the Cultist event. It can give you a very strong regen-focused build where you can get yourself hundreds of regen by stacking damage on this item. Another great option is Cybersecurity, who can be extremely strong if you can get a source of haste or charge with it in addition to the Weaponized Core, because remember the core charges the items to the right, but Weaponized Core doesn't, so you generally will want things like battery or fiber optics to help speed up the thing to the right of it. Common skills used on this are similar to the core. You want right-handed, right eye, firepower, and buddy system. With Dooley, constructing your board can be much more complex than the other two characters at times. You often need to pivot and tweak the build throughout the game to keep up with the external scaling that the other two have access to, and certain powerful items can be worth a complete sell of the board and pivot for. But to start, we're going to talk about the early game. The early game is extremely important for Dooley, as he often has an advantage early on, which falls off over time. If you lose early, it means you're going to have to fight more late game pigs and Vanessas, which can often have boards that are unbeatable for most Dooley builds. Picking a gold skill as your starting option allows you to double down on this advantage and, depending on which skill you get, either allow for a more secure early game or even provide you late game options through skills like Defense Grid or many of the monster skills. The most common skills you want to take are left-handed, strength, right-handed, fiery, final flame, immolating spark, and defense grid. Even if they don't match the core you've taken, it's generally a good idea to grab them. Paired with a rocket launcher or pulse rifle, the flat damage or burn boosting skills can give you a powerful early game build while still being relevant towards the late game. Also worth noting, for Dooley in particular, right-handed is far stronger than left due to the nature of the core, weapon core, and fiber optics, wanting the carry item to be on the far right of the board. Defense Grid buys you a lot of time to ramp your damage against non-poison builds, while enabling a powerful force field late game when paired with Bunker. It's never a bad pickup. Once you've got your skill, you want to hunt for some items that synergize with it, and, ideally, your core as well. However, don't over-focus on your core at this point. If you've got right-handed and you're on Armored Core, don't be afraid to take it off the board so you can fit a pulse rifle in friend to enable your pulse rifle. Or if you have a fire skill and a rocket launcher, focus more on that over your Armored Core. Early on, you should be trying to set up an early game board and establishing a plan for your future, while you rely on just a few powerful early game items to carry you until you can find some of your core build around items. For Dooley, a lot of these show up as silver or gold, and so that'll be, at around day 4 or 5 is when you're generally going to start picking up a lot of your core items for the builds. So some of these early game items include pulse rifle and rocket launcher, as I mentioned, but chem snail can be good as well, first aid and Uzi, and in particular blast doors can be extremely powerful when you have a slower scaling build. It allows you to survive way longer than you should against a lot of like burst Vanessa builds or matchbox, things like that, and is way more powerful than a lot of beginners think when they first read the card. So highly recommend grabbing one of those if you have the spare 2 slots for it. Another important thing to manage early on in particular is your econ. Dooley has very few econ items currently, especially when compared to the other 2 heroes, which means you need to manage your gold very carefully. Thinking carefully about what you're looking for and strategically entering shops and re-rolling can often make the difference between affording what you need and being completely out of cash. Try not to window shop or enter shops just to poke around and see maybe. Only go in if there's something that would upgrade your build or that you have a strong possibility of being a good pivot towards. Otherwise, you just want to take the free items offered as alternatives to the shop to help supplement your low econ. Upgrades on items are often not worth hunting for on Dooley, except for things that increase the scaling of your items or reduce cooldowns. Getting 25 extra damage on your power drill rarely matters in the long run, but that extra 8 gold or so might be just what you need to buy an important skill. This takes a lot of practice and game knowledge to know which items to hunt for and which shops are worth looking in, but it's a skill that transfers across all characters, so it is definitely worth learning. Just always think to yourself, what am I looking for in this shop before clicking on it? If the answer is nothing or I don't know, taking one of the free options can be very powerful instead. In addition, taking chocolate bars on day 3 or 4 can be a massive boost to Dooley's survivability and can net you many early wins you'd otherwise miss. So being very careful with your gold early is important so you can take advantage of this option. This is because Dooley doesn't have access to health boosting skills like the other heroes and generally is just squishier than Pig inherently. And so taking advantage of getting as much health as possible in any way that you can is extremely important. Another thing to maximize is, of course, XP. Well, this is important for all heroes, in particular for Dooley. Board space is at a premium early on due to the size of your core. So getting early XP can make a huge difference. Getting 1 extra XP day 1 or 2, and then taking the hardest fight, which is usually Scrapper, can ensure that you get level 3 right before the PvP fight on day 3. This gives you 2 extra slots for this fight and a lot of extra health, which is a huge power boost and can generally help you win this fight against people that didn't get the XP drop. Most often this is done through the Tiny Furry Beast event when you have a friend in your inventory, so it can often be worth just picking up a cheap friend in order to enable this event, or through the Mountain Pass event via a fight, the 1 XP 2 gold option, or if you pick the fight and just get the 1 XP option. On day 2 and 3, I often will just take the 1 XP 2 gold option as it has a much lower chance of giving you the fight on those days, and a lot of the fights can be quite difficult to finish with early game builds because of the much reduced board space and HP. So if you get like a Hellbilly on day 2, you're probably going to have a bad time. In addition, Dooley has a huge power spike at level 10 as enchantments allow him to generate way more triggers, increase synergies, or shore up a lot of the areas that you struggle with. As such, it's important to maximize XP and get to that point as soon as possible. Things like taking XP from Mountain Pass, study events, fighting as many monsters as possible, taking the most difficult monster as often as possible can allow you to get an earlier power spike, sometimes even a full day earlier, and which can often net you an extra win or two against your opponents who haven't done the same. Post level 10, it's less important to rush XP, although it's obviously still beneficial if the opportunity cost for gaining that XP isn't too high. Generally, you want to aim for getting level 10 on day 8, and getting it on day 7 is quite good. Once you've stabilized with your initial board, it's time to start looking for the core pieces of your endgame build. What you're looking for varies between runs, of course, but there are some common bread and butter items that Dooley will commonly use and can be a good pickup whenever you see them. In some cases, they'll be good as temporary pieces until you can find something more optimal, and in others, they can enable fast pivots when you find a build-enabling card that relies on them. And some are just universally powerful cards that you want to fit into almost any build. Some of these general use cards include things like Battery, Fiber Optics, Aiden, GPU, Ice Core Freezer, Metronome, Nitro, Schematics, and Uzi. These are universally small, fast items that are a net positive to any build that can fit them, with the exception of Schematics, which is Dooley's only major econ item and can enable some silly builds with duplicates or cross-class tech items. So don't be afraid to pick any of these up if you have the resources, but also don't be afraid to dump them if something better comes along. Fiber Optics and Metronome in particular can enable some of Dooley's strongest builds and are extremely powerful, and it's generally worth working your build around them if you manage to find them. Higher rarity, Battery can also have a similar power level to Metronome and Fiber Optics when being used to charge something like Bazaar or Cybersecurity or any other large, powerful item with a long cooldown. It's around this point that you'll also start getting offered silver tier skills and higher. Much like the shops, it's very important to think about what you're looking for when deciding which skill vendor to pick. Freeze and slow skills in particular are extremely powerful with many builds, particularly on Dooley, as you'll often lack access to strong crowd control until later in the game. And so these crowd control skills can help you kind of shore the gap as you make your way towards those builds. Many builds are also reliant on specific skills to enable them, so it can be important to maximize your odds of finding them. Many specific skill vendors have very limited options, and so knowing what's in each pool can help you make a more informed decision about which to pick. In some cases, it can be even beneficial to skip your silver tier upgrade in favor of an additional skill, particularly in builds where upgrades provide minimal value, such as those where you use Power Drill or Force Field, or builds where many of your items are temporary and will often get swapped out as the run progresses, such as builds relying on Friend Synergy. However, if you're running something with scaling that increases power with rarity, getting those upgraded is your first priority. Cards like Cybersecurity or Ballista are the most common examples of these. There are many others, like Thermolance or Clarence. The skills you're usually looking for are either providing additional triggers on your items or that enable additional scaling, so ones like Shatter or Firepower. Main goal once you've set up is now to establish what your win condition is going to be. Sometimes it's as simple as spamming your weapon core to charge up a Flamethrower, but other times it can be something a little bit more unintuitive, such as using Cryosphere to trigger Shatter in order to scale a weapon like Pulse Rifle. This engine can change over the course of the run, but generally you want to be scaling in some way, be it through stacking damage or status effects or both. So don't be afraid to transition your build into a stronger engine if you find the pieces for one. If you notice your build is struggling to kill opponents, evaluate what your scaling items are and how you can better support them, or if you don't have one, figure out which one would best fit in your build and where you're most likely to find it. Once you've got things established and you're happy with your engine, hunt for ways to increase the scaling or interfere with your opponent's board to buy you time to scale via slows, freezes, or increasing their cooldown. These are generally done through Enchanter skills, as Dooley has very few accessible options in the early to mid-game outside of something like cool LEDs. Later in the game, it can be a good idea to Fiber Optics a powerful disruption item like Ice Core Freezer in order to lock down your opponent's board, or using something like Atomic Clock to increase their items' cooldowns. And finally, here's some common build archetypes and their core pieces. Please note this is from the current patch, so if you're watching this from the future, please double check the item descriptions, as things can very often change in the Bazaar. This list isn't exhaustive, and creative and interesting builds are very capable of reaching 10 wins on Dooley. This is just a general list of archetypes that you're most likely to commonly see. So let's start with one of the big ones, and that is Power Drills. This is definitely one of the strongest and most popular builds right now on Dooley, but it's not necessarily because it's overwhelmingly strong. Power Drill is just extremely versatile and can be enabled in a great number of ways, and so it fits into a lot of builds and different cores. Some of the more common pieces to this build are Power Drill, Metronome, Hotspot, Shadowed Cloak, Greasefire, Soldering Gun, Solar Farm, Pylon, and Incendiary Ammo. The general game plan is to make your Power Drill trigger itself as much as possible using things like enchantments, skills, and items that trigger on usage like Fiber Optics, Metronome, etc. With enough of these, the drill will infinitely loop itself, spamming damage and status effects. Multiple drills can be used at the same time if you duplicate one from an early shop using a hammer, or if you get lucky during a level up, but it's far from required, and in many cases isn't even optimal, but it can be quite a fun build. Power Drill has a separate internal cooldown for each status effect you apply, so make sure to diversify your board. A full board spamming haste will result in a much slower Power Drill than one where you have one of each effect firing as fast as possible. The important thing for late game with Drill is to make sure you get a source of scaling, be it burn, poison, or just some way to scale its damage, as otherwise in the end game, you're going to be just firing extremely quickly but extremely low damage, and you generally won't be able to kill your opponent before they are able to kill you. Common sources of scaling are Shadowed Cloak, Shatter, Fire or Poison enchants on your Drill, or slow enchants with something like Slow and Steady or Trained. Using fiber optics can also be essentially a source of scaling, as you can use the Drill to fire off another status effect or damaging item extremely quickly. Some of the more powerful enabling skills for this build include Quick Ignition, Void Rage, Anything to Win, Hotspot, Toxic Flame, and Grease Fire. Once you've got your drill running, you can also use fiber optics to rapidly charge a useful CC item. So something like Isocork Freezer is very commonly used, but you can also use things like Sapphire or Coolant or even the Beta Ray if you're really desperate. But what this does is it allows you to lock down their entire board if your drill is going fast enough, which can buy you enough time to kill them even if your scaling isn't the best. Grabbing an early drill and holding it in your bag can generally be a decent idea, as it can be a quick pivot if you get lucky enough to get a power drill enabling skill or item. Powerful cross-class items to look for include things like Poppy Field, as it is insane with drill currently and will probably get changed at some point. Pendulum can also be extremely powerful when paired with a self-looping drill. Our next build up is one of my favorites, and it is Dinos, or, well, Dino, as this build relies entirely on Mamasaur specifically, and using her to stack damage on herself and destroy enemy items. It's a fairly straightforward build, but it is extremely fun, and it is very satisfying when you manage to chomp down one of your opponent's win conditions. It can be a little bit rare and difficult to come across, as it requires finding a fairly early Mamasaur. You generally want to use her before day 8 or 9 or so. Any later than that, and it can be difficult to get her to scale without something like Robo Factory or a fiber or a drill plus fiber to get her to go off extremely rapidly. Most commonly, you'll find her on Companion Core as she shows up in friend shops, but you can also find her in large item shops and gold shops. The general board you're going to use here is a Mamasaur, and then something to speed up her cooldown. So, for example, a battery, a source of haste, bulldozer, etc. And then you can also use something like Robotics Factory in order to give her multi-kills. The best enchants for your Dino are Heal, Shield, Obsidian, and Shiny. This is because the Sustain enchants allow you to buy enough time during the mid-game to destroy larger portions of their board, while Obsidian and Shiny lean more in towards kind of a one-shot build where you're trying to delete them in the first chomp. When running this build, make sure to go to as many PvE encounters as possible, and generally try to go to PvE encounters that have a larger number of small items, as this allows your Dino to stack up as much damage as possible. Going to encounters like Living District can often cost you the game, as your Dino will get no stacking at all that day, which can make a big difference in PvP. Our next build is Cybersecurity, the big man himself. This build is pretty slept on by the overall community, but is actually quite strong. Big Man's event is essentially the dually equivalent of Vanessa's Sniper. He scales heavily with rarity and multiplies the damage buffs you put into him, while also gaining damage based on your board composition. However, his cooldown is quite long, so you want to use something to decrease that. So you could use the core, a battery, or some form of haste similar to the dinosaurs. This build works best with the core, crit core, or weapon core, but you can run it critless if you get enough cooldown reduction and similar pieces. Main focus here is XP farming and hunting for cybersecurity upgrades. His damage raises dramatically with rarity, and he isn't really worth using at all at silver, but at gold and diamond he really pops off. And at diamond in particular, you really get into one-shot territory. Once you got him upgraded and firing fast enough, focus on upping his damage through things like skills and flat damage from artisan dunes, as well as gaining crit chance through skills, events, and loot. Common skills you'll want with this build are right-handed, firepower, or right eye, and then any skills that add flat damage or crit chance are a welcome addition. Late game, Robotics Facility is a viable option, as the loss in flat damage by removing items from your board is made up by the multi-kills. Just don't take it at the cost of any of your charging items, as that is the most important thing for the cybersecurity build. Next up, we have Flamethrower. This build is quite similar to Cybersecurity, but with a bit of a more narrow build path due to Dooley's lack of damage stacking items. The main idea is stacking damage on your Flamethrower and then killing your opponent with hundreds of burn in 1 to 2 uses of your Flamethrower. The main items are, of course, the Flamethrower, and then a battery or fiber optics to charge it quicker, metronome for haste, and some sort of damage buff. The usual way of stacking damage on your Flamethrower is generally going to be left-handed or right-handed or other flat damage buffs when you have no other weapons, a weapon core, the firepower skill, or some sort of cross-class item, generally from Vanessa. This build is only viable as a late-game pivot or payoff. As it is a gold plus item, you can't really force it very well most runs. Upgrading it is also a very high priority, similar to Cybersecurity, as it doubles the damage to burn scaling on it. Obsidian or Fiery are the best enchants for big burn damage numbers, but defensive options like shielding or healing can be good as they allow you to stay alive a little bit longer while your massive burn ticks destroy your opponent. Our next build is another one that is a little bit unusual, but can be quite powerful, and that is a Pulse Rifle Hypercarry build. Pulse Rifle Hypercarry can be very difficult to play, often relying on unintuitive builds and odd interactions, but it can be quite rewarding when played properly. As the name suggests, this build relies entirely on the Pulse Rifle and scaling it to be your main source of damage. Rocket Launcher can also work as an alternative if you're unable to find the Pulse Rifle, although the longer cooldown hurts it quite a bit. But skills with flat burn or conflagration can make this variant a much stronger option. This can be done with any core, as you'll often be taking your core off the board, but with Companion Core, it can be an interesting alternative option to your standard friend builds. When playing this build, you want to prioritize Curio heavily, as the shop gives you access to a lot of the items you need to really make this build excel. Cooldown reduction, Shadowed Cloak, damage, and items like Knee Brace increase your survivability greatly and provide scaling. Your main goal in this style of build is to reduce the cooldown of your Pulse Rifle through things like feathers, wings, or skills, finding a source of haste for your rifle, most commonly something like Metronome, Shadow Cloak, or the Companion Core itself. It's worth noting that a Companion Core with a silver GPU next to it provides 100% haste uptime, and then some sort of method of scaling your damage. This will generally be something like Shatter plus some freeze items, or a higher tier Shadow Cloak. Other options include some form of shielding, such as a shielded Pulse Rifle with sharp corners, or a source of slow and the slow and steady skill. Defensive enchants such as shield or healing are generally the best options here, as they buy you enough time to ramp the damage of your Pulse Rifle in order to take out your opponents. Next up is one of the strongest builds in the game, but also one that can be a little bit rare and hard to pull off. It is the Force Field. This build is very glass cannon in most cases, but if set up properly, will often one-shot most of your opponents before their items even have a chance to fire. This works by using the initial shield you gain from the defense grid skill to kill your opponents in 1 to 2 force field shots. This build relies heavily on the defense grid skill to the point where it's extremely difficult to set up without it, but it is still possible. If you get defense grid as your starting golden skill, it is always a good option to pivot into this regardless of your core, so keep an eye out for it whenever you get that start. Important things for this build are force field, a battery, and some cooldown reduction or haste for your force field, and a bunker would be ideal. Shiny or Obsidian are your best enchants here, but you can make poison or burn work as well. Crit is also highly beneficial, and items like Security Camera can be extremely useful if you're able to fit them on your board. Your main goal here is to fire off the force field as fast as possible while using a secondary item to trigger the effects of defense grid. Battery works best for this, but you can also use things like Uzi or Aiden or Light Bulb that go off just before the force field, so your opponent has as little time as possible between the shield triggering and your force field firing. With many items being slowed from the previous patch, you have a very good shot at getting your force field to fire off within about 4-ish seconds. And then with Bunker, Shiny, Crit, or Obsidian, you'll often one-tap your opponent. While building this, stacking health is extremely beneficial as defense grid scales with your total HP. If you are unable to find defense grid, you can make this work with a reserve shield. However, it does require multicast from your force field or some other fast, large item to trigger the initial shield. Next, we have the Friend Synergy builds. There are several archetypes here that you can work towards, but generally they'll revolve around Ballista or Clarence as your carry. We'll go over the DJ robots and nanobots as a separately. While these builds work without Companion Core, most of the time you'll have difficulty in the early game if you try to force these builds without it. The tricky part of these builds is that you're going to need to be constantly swapping in and out friends throughout the run and adjusting it in order to get the best performance out of them. Early on, you'll be using something like Chem Snail or Monitor Lizard as your carry of choice, and then you're going to move on to something like Bulldozer or Carl or Clarence in the mid-game, and with your endgame will almost always focus on something like Ballista or occasionally Clarence. You have to constantly monitor your build's performance and adapt to the items you find. It also requires very careful management of funds, as you'll need to be buying and selling friends often, and upgrades are far more important than they are for most dually builds. You can't entirely rely on level up upgrades. This is one of the few cores where income is generally a good choice, as the early game buff you get from gold skills is often outweighed by the extra buying power to give you additional friends and upgrades. Core items here are Aiden, Bill, Ballista, Metronome, Clarence, Carl, Missiles, Robotics Factory, and DJ Robot. Your endgame revolves around triggering your friends or your core as fast as possible for Clarence, or spamming haste onto Ballista using Race Carl and Metronome, and sometimes the core plus Missiles and Metronome. For enchants, Race Carl's frequent activations make him a good target for status effect enchants such as Burn, Poison, Slow, etc. Haste in particular helps him activate even faster and can often create a full loop when using him with Bill. However, this comp tends to struggle with to fit both survivability and disruption into this build outside of enchants or skills. So generally it's quite important to get those through enchants if you're able to. Getting a shielded Ballista can be extremely powerful and can enable you to scale up your build enough to defeat even stronger opponents by buying you enough time with the shield. There are only a few useful skills to this style of build, but Command Ship is generally going to be one of the high rolls, as Bulldozer and Carl are both vehicles and can enable the powerful cooldown reduction that the skill offers. Now, for those who enjoy using their core as a weapon, Red Core Hypercarry may be something to try. This build entirely focuses around Motherboard's passive effect, giving your core damage whenever it gains haste. You can use Metronome with a fast item like Uzi to continuously haste your core to scale the damage quite rapidly, or something more unusual like Pyrocarbon and Nitro can work quite well. There are a lot of options here. Anything that's able to spam haste on the core can get the job done. However, this board tends to be pretty feast or famine. If you fail to find Motherboard in a reasonable amount of time, you'll often need to pivot to a coreless build to survive the late game. Charging Station can also be a good alternative to Motherboard if you're unable to find it. In this variant, you'll instead focus on spamming the core as fast as possible to stack the damage rather than spamming haste. So you'll want things like battery and fiber optics in this variant. The core items for this build are, of course, the critical core. You can also use the other red cores, so the core or weapon core, although it doesn't work quite as well because you lack the passive crit and the double and the self-charging that you get from critical core. Motherboard, cooldown reduction items to use on your core, Metronome, GPU, and Charging Station as an alternative. This build also works well in double core builds utilizing the combat core. However, this one tends to work a little bit better with the core over crit core to help mitigate the combat core's quite long cooldown. This option does tend to leave you with very little space on the board. However, you benefit from scaling two cores at once. Oftentimes, it can be better to use a solo core or a solo combat core instead, depending on your haste setup. So make sure you monitor your board closely to get the most out of your items. Remember, combat core does count as a core, so any items or skills that affect your main core affect it as well, with the exception of the remote. Protection enchants are a must-have for this build, in particular with the solo core variant, as it is very difficult to fit any survivability onto this build and it needs a lot of time to ramp. So things like shielded or healing on your core help greatly to buy you time to ramp up. Up next is Burn. Mostly exclusive to the Ignition Core, Burn builds are less popular than their Power Drill counterparts, but can definitely still work with the right setup. They generally rely on stacking as much burn as possible on enemies as fast as possible using powerful burn items like Rocket Launcher and Soldering Gun. While it may be tempting to place all your burn items to the right of the core, oftentimes it's better just to have everything on the left so the core can apply its own burn even faster and take advantage of the natural scaling of burn stacking. The main concern with this build is that it relies heavily on skills to scale the burn on its main items. Relying on the Ignition Core's intrinsic scaling is often far too slow later in the game unless you have some powerful defensive enchants at your disposal to buy you time to take advantage of it. The core items here are Rocket Launcher, Soldering Gun, the Ignition Core itself, Solar Farm, Thermal Lance, Nitro, we'll talk more about Thermal Lance later, Nitro, and potentially Microdave. Powerful skills in this include Quick Ignition, Fiery, Chemical Fire, Draconic Rage, Living Flame, Final Flame, Conflagration, and Emulating Spark all help really enable this build, so it's important to hunt for them whenever possible. Upgrades on burn items tend to be a minimal improvement compared to finding burn skills, so oftentimes you'll want to forego your upgrades in order to grab additional burn skills. The exception of this is the Thermal Lance, which you'll want to upgrade as much as possible. This build can easily transition into a drill build if you fail to find the proper skills for the burn itself, or you can run it as a hybrid and get a fire enchant on your burn drill. Next we have Thermal Lance. Newly buffed in the second open beta patch, Thermal Lance is now an extremely strong option on Dooley, and it can compete with some of his best items. This build involves spamming haste on your Thermal Lance, and generally the rest of your board as well, and using the scaling on it to burn your opponent for hundreds of burn damage at a time. This works very similarly to things like Motherboard Crit Core Carry or to Ballista. So you'll see similar setups here, with the exception that Solar Farm is a lot stronger due to the spamming burn aspects. The Main ways to do this are through Metronome with a fast item like Uzi or a looping power drill, Solar Farm with some fast burn items, or a Pyrocarbon with self-burn like Nitro or Thrusters, or most often some combination of these ideas. Thermalance scales heavily with levels, so focus on finding upgrades and using level ups on it whenever possible. For enchants, you usually want to aim for defensive ones, as the majority of your board space is taken up by pieces to spam haste and enable your thermal lance. It's difficult to find space for defenses or disruption skills. Luckily, thermal lance has extremely good synergy with enchants like healing or shielding, as they scale extremely high if you can get the lance firing fast enough, and if you can get the lance firing fast enough, it becomes extremely difficult to kill you while your burn stacks up. Other scaling ones like Obsidian, Poison, or Fiery are reasonable, but if you go that route, you'll want to fit some disruption into your build another way, mainly through skills or enchants on your other items. There aren't any particularly strong skills for this build outside of things like Retool to give Thermal Lance multicast, so mainly look for utility skills to help disrupt the enemy, such as freeze or slow skills. And then last but certainly not least is the Mighty Crane. This build involves using fast-firing medium or large items to juice the damage on your crane and knock out your opponents in one big hit. Common enablers for this are the pulse rifle, a core, or an atomic clock. You also generally want a way to speed the crane up, as it is a very slow cooldown by itself. Battery or fiber optics are good picks for the job, or any source of haste can also be sufficient. The crane's scale increases dramatically once it's upgraded to diamond, so make sure you get it upgraded as soon as possible if you're planning on trying out this build. It's one of the less consistent builds here, but it's consistently fun for blasting people for 100,000 damage, so I'd recommend giving it a try if you ever get the chance. Command ship is again extremely powerful here, as the crane itself counts as a vehicle, and it lowers the CDR of the items that charge it up. And finally, of course, our Jank builds. This one isn't really a specific build itself, but do not be afraid to try out weird things with Dooley. He has a ton of good enablers to use cross-class items, or weird monster items, or anything you can find. Dooley can make lots of weird stuff work, so experiment and find your own combinations. Some of the most fun builds come from fitting weird items together from monsters and cross-class skills together with like fiber optics and battery, so don't be afraid to try something out new and make it work. Don't try to force one build every time. It gets extremely boring, and it's much more fun to just come up with something creative and see what kind of puzzle pieces you can fit together. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and you found at least something useful in there. I'll try to keep this updated as much as possible in the comments if things have changed, as they likely will with the full release. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me and I'll do my best to get to them and answer. As well as if you have any suggestions for a future guide you might like to see. I've mainly played Dooley, so I can't really do much for Vanessa or Pig, but I can do individual build guides or example runs with each of these builds. If that's something that people are interested in, just let me know. So I hope all of you have a wonderful day, and I will see you all next time.